Hi, it's Penny here, and today we're going to be talking through my reading stats for 2020. So I have a big spreadsheet of all 168 books that I read in 2020, and I have put together a bunch of statistics about those books for us to talk through. So firstly, those books do come out to 25,246 pages throughout the year, as well as 1,110-ish hours of audiobooks. Which interestingly means that I was listening to about 3 hours of audiobooks every day. That's probably about right, because I was either walking or commuting while I listened to them, and I do listen on 1.7 times speed, so it's probably actually only a couple of hours of audiobook listening every day. As well, I was reading about 70 pages a day, which means for my physical or digital, but like the books that I was actually reading pages, not listening to. For those, it was taking me about 4 and a bit days to read each book, which again is probably what I remember for the most part. So we can trust that these statistics are accurate. Maybe. So firstly, we're looking at the amount of books I've read throughout the year. So if we look at the books throughout the year, you can see that my worst reading month was in June. That's because that's when New Zealand came out of lockdown. We did go back into lockdown in July, which is why July was my best reading month. I think in the early lockdown, I did read more, but there was also all that uncertainty going on with the newness of COVID. Whereas in July, when we got put in lockdown again, just in Auckland of New Zealand, we got put in a second lockdown, and I basically just went, oh well, back in lockdown, eh? I'm just gonna read some books. So I gave up on everything and just read, and that was nice. Nice. It is interesting to see though, in terms of pages, July was not my best reading month. My best reading month was actually April, and that would have been also because of the COVID thing. I was just locked down, whereas in July I think I read a lot more shorter books. Either way, lockdown was definitely beneficial for my reading, at least. You will also notice December was my absolute worst reading month. I only read 2 books. Yeah, basically from September my reading dropped right down, and that was because I got a new job, which is a good thing because I really needed the money, but not so great for my reading. What I think is also interesting to see is that in terms of audiobooks, pretty stable throughout the year. There kind of seems to be like 2 levels. One level is kind of like 50 to 60-ish hours, and then the other one is more like 125-ish hours. Looking at it, I think that comes down to how much walking I was doing. I actually think it'd be interesting to match that against my Fitbit step stats. Let me look. I mean, not exactly, but pretty close. Pretty close. Interesting. The more steps I do, the more I read. The last thing I will talk about is my average rating. So overall, my average rating for all the books I read was 3.29 stars. And that seemed to be pretty steady throughout the year. You can kind of see there's 3 lumps, but they're not significantly different. December does jump up a bit, but that's because I only read 2 books and they were both 4 stars. That's cheating. Then we're going to move on to the source of the books. So where did I get the books from, the ones that I read? Quite a lot of different places, as it turns out. Ideally, I would like to be reading a lot of books off my TBR. I really wanted to get to TBR 0, and I can see, looking at these statistics, that the reason why I didn't get to that is because I read far too many books that weren't on my TBR. So only 15% of the books that I read were from my TBR. And also, in total, 81% of the books were books that I borrowed, primarily from the library, and a lot of those were audiobook borrows. Like 50% of the full amount, I think, was audiobook library things, 47.6%. And the rest were like ones I borrowed from my family. Like 20% were just like general library books. Oh, and 9.5% were library ebooks. So a lot of my reading was library books. I also did borrow a few books from my family, which I was wanting to borrow a book from my sister every month, but I really just couldn't keep up with my library books. Part of the problem with that was that during lockdown, I watched a lot of BookTube and I saw a lot of exciting books, and I put holds on them at the library. And then another reason why July's reading was up was that all my library holds came through, and so I had to read them before I had to return them. So one thing I would like to think about as I go through these stats is whether these statistics are what I would like things to be like in 2021, or whether I need to try to change things. I definitely would like my owned books that I'm reading to be higher than 19%. In fact, just my TBR books, I'd like that to be higher than 15%. I would like that to be more like 50%, but that's 100% unrealistic because 50% of the books I read are audio library books, and I'm always going to also have some physical books from the library. What's a realistic goal? 25%? I need to write these goals down. I think I'll do a separate video on my goals. I'll think about these more before I do that, before I set those goals. But I really want to try and get TBR 0, and I think if I did more like 25% of my books off my TBR, that would be achievable, maybe? Maybe. I mean, I'm not sad about borrowing so many books from the library. It's a great cheap way to get books and read lots of books, but I do already have quite a lot of books just over there. Also, I did try to look at how this changed throughout the year. Oh, actually, you know what? I think it was May we came out of lockdown and a lot of my holds came through, and then more of them came through in July. That's why you can see throughout the year in May there's quite a big blue section, which is where my library books came through. As I said, audiobooks were pretty steady throughout the year, but what you can see is that I was doing quite well in my TBR in the beginning of the year, especially in that last month of full lockdown. But once I got my new job, I did really terribly at getting to the books on my TBR. I mean, one solution to that would be to not have a job, but that's not a sensible solution. So I guess we're just going to need to figure out how to fit in reading and booktube into a life that also has a full-time job somehow. Okay, now let's talk about the year that my books were released. So firstly, 15-ish% were books released in 2020. That's actually pretty good. I think maybe I would like that to be a little bit more, but there's also so many great books that I'm still trying to catch up on, so I don't know when I'm going to be able to make that more, really. Also, like overall, more than half the books I've read were from within the last 5 years, which I think is pretty good considering. There's definitely still a lot of older science fiction and fantasy that I would like to try and read, so I don't really know what my target is here. I do think it's interesting to look at this throughout the year. So you can see in November I read a lot of 2020 releases, so I was trying to catch up on all my new releases, and I think also quite a lot ended up being released in November because they've been pushed back because of COVID. So COVID's messing with my stats all over the place. I think as well some of the older books were all part of series, so that added multiple books into those categories. Anyway, I think overall I'm happy with this, but maybe I would like new releases to be a bit higher? Maybe. I don't know. What do you think is a good percentage of your reading to be the books that are being released in that current year? Well, what I will notice as well is that I looked at the average rating for each of the different year ranges, and for the most part, it didn't have too much of a difference, except for books released between 2010 and 2014 were a bit lower than the rest, and I think that's because I was reading some older, hyped dystopians from that time. YA dystopians, and they weren't my favorite. I think that's what that was. So I need to not do that so much. And as well, the 90s, books from the 90s are a little bit lower, and I think that is because I started reading the Sandman comics and was kind of disappointed in it. So yeah, but in general, I don't think it's the actual release years that is affecting my rating. So, I mean, overall, I think I would like to figure out how to make my average rating a bit higher, but this is not going to be the way to do it, I don't think. So let's move on to genre, because I do think that this is interesting too. No, it's not. I'm looking now. So basically, this is the split of the genres that I read. A significant amount was fantasy. I actually thought that I read a lot more science fiction this year, but fantasy is still a significant part of my reading. Still a decent amount of science fiction. I think I would actually maybe like that to be a bit more. What I find really interesting about this is that I thought that I don't really like mystery thrillers, or that I'm really fussy about which ones I like. But like, firstly, I didn't read that many, so like, what do I know? And also, like, the average rating is not lower than the other genres. In fact, none of these genres are significantly different in ratings than the others. But what this would suggest is that I should be reading more mystery thriller and horrors. So maybe, we'll see. I think as well, if you look at how this was split out through the year, you can see during that lockdown period, I was reading a lot of different genres. But then once I got a new job, I pretty much just locked it down to just fantasy, because my brain could not handle anything else. Okay, so now we are going to move on to the demographic that the books were targeted at. So basically middle grade, YA, or adult. So you can see that most of the books that I read were adult at 58%. Still read 27% of YA books though, and 14% of middle grade, which is higher than I thought it would be. I think ideally I would like to read slightly less middle grade, make it more like 10% and maybe like 20% YA and then 70% adult. I really want to read more adult works because I do think I enjoy them more. I am an adult after all, but I wouldn't want to completely cut out YA and middle grade because there are definitely some that I really enjoy. So I don't know. Moving on to gender. So I'm fairly happy with 60% female, 35.7 male. Is probably fine. Historically, I know that I have read a lot more women authors and I have been trying to give the men a go, but like not too much of a go, you know, because there's plenty of other people reading them. Then my category various, 3.6%, that's ones where it's different genders writing together, so multiple authors. I don't really have a goal for that, that's fine, but what I did find interesting is that that rating was much higher than the female or the male average rating. So 3.3 for female and male, and then 3.7 for when they write together. So I should be looking for that. We'll also note though that the average rating for non-binary authors was 4, but that's because I only read one. So, and it was really great, and I definitely want to read more by that particular author. I also don't really know what is a reasonable target for reading non-binary authors. Like I would like to read more just for a different perspective, but also I always think that maybe when I'm trying to read diversely, should it be somewhat representative of, like if I'm looking at the split of what I'm reading, should it be somewhat representative of the split with it in the real world? So then I would say, you know, I should be aiming for about 52% female, 48% male. And then I looked it up and like the percentage of non-binary is only about 0.2% in the population, but then I know that that's probably underreported and it's pretty hard to get like concrete statistics on that anyway at this point. And there's definitely also an argument for saying that you should read more of minorities, like more than the typical representation of minorities, because their voices are heard less and they're more likely to be voices with perspectives that you wouldn't get from other places. So I think in 2021 I'll try to read more than one. That's a pretty low goal, but that's what we're going to try for, to at least improve on that. Males can stay about the same. I do worry, because I've been trying to read some more books that are highly rated that I haven't read, and I worry that that's going to mean I read a lot more male authored books, so I don't really want the males to get over 40%. So then we'll move on to race. This is another one where I was looking at the split and I was thinking, what split am I actually aiming for here? And I tried looking up like the actual percentage splits of different races in the world, and it was really difficult and also not necessarily what I think I'm aiming for, because the fact is there are a lot of Asian people in the world and a lot of them are creating and consuming media in a language that I don't speak. In fact, there's a lot of people in the world creating and consuming things in a language I don't speak, and while I can read translated works, and I did read some translated works, I don't think those percentages are a very realistic target for me to be hitting, or even the right target. Then I looked at the split of race in New Zealand, which is where I live, and it seems more realistic. I'm still not sure that it is the best target, but it's at least a place to start, because what I did this year is I didn't make too much of an effort to change my reading according to race. I primarily just tried to read what I would normally read, and then I thought that would give me a baseline, and then this year in 2021 I can try to improve. So I'll put on screen here kind of the split of New Zealand population versus what I actually read. Now you can see 76.2% of the authors I read were white. That is slightly too high. I want to be aiming, from what I can see in the New Zealand population, I'm going to aim for more like 65%. I do think that should be achievable. Also note that I read about 9.5% of black authors. The percentage of black and other, wraps them all up into another in the official statistics, because we just don't really have that many people of African descent in New Zealand. So I'm kind of happy with leaving that about where it is. And I know that because a lot of other booktube people are focusing on reading more Black authored books, that just naturally I will hear about more. So I think that will naturally improve. And I think it kind of did in 2020 already. Also, I read 9.5% of Asian authored books, and I think that that is a bit low, both when you look at the overall representation in the world and also the representation in New Zealand. I think I want to be putting that more at about 15%. What is the lighting doing? I don't know. Maybe that's better. So 15% or maybe more, because I know that all this maths that I'm about to do isn't going to line up. Because what I am missing when we look at the population of New Zealand, a significant number is Maori and Pacific people. I did try to find a lot of Maori and Pacific authored books that I would be interested in, because I don't feel that it's useful for me to read books written by authors of different races from me if they're not books I'm going to be interested in anyway, because then I'm just going to give them a bad rating and it's not particularly useful for anybody. Like, I don't have a good time, I'm not helping them. Maybe I'm broadening my perspective, but I'd rather broaden my perspective by reading books that also I might enjoy. And unfortunately, I just don't think there's the representation of these races in the publishing industry. So it's been very difficult to find books by these authors, especially modern books. I actually looked and I found a lot from the 80s and 90s, but not many from like now, which has been really frustrating me. And I only managed to read one Maori authored science fiction in 2020. I did find some more, and I want to definitely read more in 2021 and make more of an effort to find more that I think I'm going to like. I do know they exist. I just need to find them. They're a lot harder to find than some other books. So definitely, if you know any Maori or Pacific authored fantasies or science fictions, maybe thrillers or horrors, then leave them down in the comments so I can put them on my list. I feel like the maths means that I'll still have 5 to 10% left over, and so I want to try and read more diversely with that final 5 to 10% as well. I mean, there's a lot of different people in the world, and I would like to get a lot of different perspectives. That's part of what I like about reading, is reading different perspectives, so why would I not? It's just harder because we know that the publishing industry pushes white European authors a lot more. Possibly we're getting some slight improvement, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be trying to find some of them on my own. I'm going to try and keep doing better in that. Probably I'll need to keep trying to do better for a while. And really, there's all sorts of other diversity things that I should be looking to broaden my perspectives with, but we'll start with just gender and race, I think, for a beginning. Now, let's move on to my ratings. So looking at the numbers of each star ratings that I gave, you can see it's fairly nicely distributed, with the 1s and 2s being a bit lower and then the 4 and 5s being a bit higher. That's what I want. Honestly, what I would really like is not to read any 1s and 2s, but then I feel like in that situation I wouldn't be taking any risks. And sometimes by taking risks is how you find books that you never thought you would like, but you absolutely love. So I'm not sad about there being some 1s and 2s, but I would like there to be more 4s and 5s. I am very stingy with giving out 5s though. So I feel like if I was reading more 4s and 5s, I would just give out the same amount of 5s and I would put more of them as 4s. Also, looking at how that spread out through the year, it mostly seems pretty even. I mean, maybe April was a particularly good reading month. It's not that different from July. It kind of, or maybe it does kind of look like whenever I read more books, I just read more 3 stars and the rest don't change that much. So maybe I really do just need to focus on quality rather than quantity. I can definitely say there are books I read which I knew would be 3 stars and they were 3 stars, and why did I bother? 3 stars is still okay though. It's still an okay reading experience. And if everyone else is reading it, then at least you know what they're talking about, right? I don't know. I read a lot of books, so I'm not sad about spending some time on 3-star ones. Oh, and then the last statistic I have is talking about the length of the books that I read. So this is another one where the length doesn't seem to have a significant impact, although maybe longer books are very slightly higher. As well, you can see that most of the books I am reading are between 300 and 400 pages, which is kind of what I would have expected, and then books that are 400 to 500 or 200 to 300 are pretty close after that. I also read quite a lot between 100 and 200, but that is because of reading graphic novels, I am certain, because a lot of those are 124 or 160 pages long. Then as far as audiobooks go, I'm not sure about my grouping here, but you can see most of the audiobooks I read are between 10 and 12 hours. And then there was also quite a few that were between 20 and 30 hours. But again, it was those longer audiobooks that had a slightly higher rating. So maybe in 2021, I just need to be brave and read more longer books, which will probably mean I read less books, but that's okay, right? I think that's okay. And that is all the stats that I gathered for the year. Do let me know if you think there's anything else in particular that you think would be useful for me to track. I don't want to make this too much. Already filling out the spreadsheet I feel like takes a bit of time when you finish a book, and I didn't fill it out for several months and had to go back and fill it out, and that was quite annoying, to be honest. So I wouldn't really want to add more than 1 or 2 things, but if there are things that you think might be really interesting for me to try and understand my reading better, and especially to try and understand what I like better, because what I found is pretty much all of the different stats that I've collected here, none of them are significantly impacting my rating, except maybe longer books were slightly higher, but otherwise it's not really giving me any clues about how I could read higher rated books. I don't think I talked about, like, in terms of race, the average ratings, I'm looking at it now, the average ratings are actually pretty even, except that Maori books slightly higher, and books where the authors were of different races, or it was an individual who has ancestry from different races, various I've called them, those were higher rated. So that really does confirm that I should be trying to find, I really like that idea actually, of like the mixed perspectives being ones that I appreciate even more. And also I really need to find more Maori fantasy and science fiction writers. But anyway, those were my stats. Do let me know if you found any of those stats particularly interesting and if you collect any of the same stats. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.